Hello, everyone, and welcome to this weird and wonderful world of children, brought to you by the Developmental and Educational Science Group at Goldsmith University and by Baby Brains, the bridge between science and society. I'm Dr. Sylvia Dalvit at Baby Brains, and from Goldsmith, we have Dr. Robert Chapman. Welcome, Robert.
Well, hello, thank you for having me. Apologies for doing this from home, but we had problems on campus last time, so I thought it was the safer bet.
It's a very beautiful home. So it's wonderful to speak, and thank you for making time and to talk to us about genes and environment and babies. And this is just so relevant for all of us. So we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us. And what's even better is that then we get to ask our questions, and even if people are following online, and if you want to ask questions in the comments, you're most welcome to do so, and we will then pass them on to Robert. So
Fantastic.
I'll put on your slides and give you the mic.
Lovely. Excellent. Okay, so you can hear me, everything's working fine? Yep, excellent. Okay, so yeah, my
Wonderful.
name
Yes,
is
thank you.
Robert Chapman. I always forget to introduce myself, so thank you, Sylvia, for doing that. And I'm going to talk to you about genetics. Now, some of the things, or the first slide I included, isn't going to work on this setup. But I just before the meeting, I quickly Googled whether I know Marmite is a French word, but I wondered whether you have the Marmite product in France. It's a kind of
We actually don't.
an acquired taste. This is a video. So a couple of years ago, Marmite did an ad campaign where you could send off a saliva sample and they would sequence your genome and see if you had a genetic variant that they said would predict whether or not you like Marmite. So it's what we call a very monogenic view. There is one gene that is the thing that distinguishes you whether you're a Marmite lover or hater. And they had a whole ad campaign. It was about £100 to send off your genetic data to them. And this was the television advert that ran alongside it, which is an interesting one to watch because it's a sort of a parallel for what could potentially be conversations in the future of you can see in this still a pregnant woman is just discovering that she's a Marmite lover and genetically her partner is a Marmite hater, and the trauma that she's going through knowing that she's carrying a hater's baby. So it's worth a watch. The link to the YouTube video is there, and just reflecting on how realistic that is, not particularly. As we'll see, almost everything that makes us who we are, what genes are really important, but they're not deterministic. They are probabilistic. Even when we talk about rare genetic disorders, they're not necessarily deterministic. So I will go through this. I love this topic, so I get a bit sort of passionate and distracted, and I hope you'll find some of these things interesting. One of the things that has come out recently is that there's absolutely no genetic basis for the concept of race. There are sociological arguments, there are cultural arguments, but from the point of view of genetics, it just makes no sense. And this little thought experiment might help with that. Again, maybe in your own time, have a look at these images and try to order them as you think they may be genetically related. So you might think, okay, so I would order them 1, 2, 5, 4, 3, 6 or something. Now, all we know from these pictures is that, in fact, the two most genetically distinct people are from sub-Saharan Africa. So these two people are from different tribes in sub-Saharan Africa. One from Nigeria, one from the Congo, if I remember rightly. So all we know is that they are more genetically distinct from each other than from any of the other pairings. And so on a genetic level, we know that race has no meaning, really. On a behavioral level, historical phenomenological level, we know this because of how the human race sort of migrated out of Africa and populated the rest of the world. So these, I'm just going to throw things out there and hopefully some of them will stick and be of interest. So yes, there is no genetic basis for race. One of those myths that I think is really important to dispel at the moment, because there are still lots of people trying to make very essentialist arguments for race differences, and they're just not true. They're just not true. So I thought that was an important myth to dispel right from the outset. Now, I mentioned earlier this kind of monogenic view of loving or hating Marmite. Um, there are very few human traits that are genuinely monogenic, that can be tied to one genetic variant. So people talk about rolling your tongue, which is not a monogenic trait, and there's very few. Some examples here: having a cleft in your chin, freckles. Your type of earwax is a monogenic trait. You can either have dry or wet earwax. And there are some unusual case histories. So the blue fugates from America, somewhere in Appalachia, I think. And they have an overabundance of a certain protein, which gives some of them a blue tinge. And we often see traits like that occurring more often in interbred families. But these monogenic traits are very rare. Monogenic diseases do happen. And these things that may be familiar to you in your own experiences of planning a family and raising children. In the UK, as soon as a baby's born, it's given what we call a heel prick test, and that takes a small blood sample and tests for 9 genetic disorders with known kind of etiologies and treatments. That's the important thing, because a lot more than 9 could be tested. Some countries do up to 20, some do just 1 or 2. And it's the treatment that's the key thing there, because in this case, phenylketonuria, if that disorder is identified before the baby begins to suckle and wean, the negative impacts of that disorder can be completely ameliorated. They can be taken away, because people with PKU, they can't process phenylalanine because of a genetic mutation, which means that phenylalanine builds up in their blood. It's not passed out in the urine, and that can lead to developmental delay and all sorts of behavioral and cognitive difficulties. But if that baby never ingests phenyl, then it can't build up in the body, and so those cognitive and behavioral aspects never manifest. And so even when we know that something has a genetic cause, it doesn't mean that it's determined, because this environmental intervention can completely kind of remove the negative aspects of this complete genetic disorder. So we'll probably talk a little bit more in the Q&A about nature versus nurture. It's never like an all or nothing. It's always the kind of the interplay of those two things. There is, like I say, several other single gene disorders which are tested for at birth, but PKU is a really striking example. So sometimes we talk about monogenic traits, but generally speaking, in the area that I research, behavioral genetics, we're more interested in traits variation across the population. So common traits: intelligence, achievement, focus, motivation, schizophrenia, ADHD, dyslexia. These things that vary in populations, they're the things that really interest us. So just to sort of lay this out, the nature nurture versus nurture debate is sort of put to bed. It's always an interaction, and we can ask interesting questions about that interaction. And that's really what behavioral genetics is all about. So it's a sort of an interdisciplinary approach that uses psychology, biology, genetics, and an awful lot of statistics. There are behavioral genetic studies done with animals. Any dog owners will know that the history of dog breeding is fascinating and complex. What does constitute a species and what doesn't? A breed of dog and what doesn't? They're all the same species. But really, because we're talking about babies and children, we're interested in humans. quite often the way we ask questions about the relative influences of genes and environments is by taking advantage of this sort of natural experiment. Um, uh, because twins come in two types. So we can have identical twins, which we call monozygotic, or non-identical, which are dizygotic. So essentially, apart from a few what we call de novo mutations, identical twins share 100% of their DNA. They are identical. Non-identical twins share 50% of their DNA. Now we have to we have to be cautious here because we also share 50% of our DNA with a banana. So when you're reading about these things, if you're encountering newspaper headlines or doing some sort of research, bear in mind sometimes we talk about the whole genome, which is what I was doing when I was talking about the banana. And then on other occasions, we're only talking about that bit of the DNA that can actually vary within humans. And that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the non-identical twins. So we're all 99.8-ish% identical in our DNA. But of that little bit that can vary, non-identical twins share about half of that, and identical twins share all of that. Now, because of that, what we can do is look at a trait. Let's take something really tangible like height. And if we can see that identical twins are more similar in their height than non-identical twins, then we can infer that that increased similarity in identical twin pairs is because of genetics. Yeah. And so we can then do lots of complicated maths and statistics on that, which then allow us to pick apart in a population how heritable a trait is, so how important genes are for those traits. Now, this is not the best slide because I haven't actually put the numbers on here, but these are some common traits that can be particularly interesting throughout the lifespan. I was going to say childhood, but alcoholism is there, and hopefully that's not that's not something that's of a concern for children yet. Um, but the larger the font here, the more important it is estimated that genetic influences are. So you can see something like intelligence is actually what we would call highly heritable. There are a lot of genetic influences in intelligence. Now, that definitely doesn't mean throw your hands up and don't even bother going to school, because environments make a huge difference. We've seen that already in the case of PKU. There's some personality traits here. There's also some more abstracted things like artistic interests and religiousness. Now, I've talked about heritability. It's a complex concept, and I'm not expecting anybody to be comfortable with it. In my own data, certainly not after 20 minutes, in my own research, I collected data that shows that people really don't understand this concept. Or they don't understand the word. They're actually quite good with the concept. They sort of understand that genes are really important for lots of things and more important in some areas than others. But actually identifying the word is quite difficult internationally, is what we've been finding. So a couple of things that I think it's really important to just kind of peg down about this concept, because you will come across it. You probably will start noticing it more and more now that it's in your minds. They're specific to a population at a specific time. So the heritability of school achievement in the UK will be different to the heritability of school achievement in France. I say that, I don't know if France has a national curriculum, but here in the UK, every school follows the same in France. There's no national curriculum in the United States, so that's probably a better comparison. They change across development. We'll have a little look at that. They are about variance within a population, not differences between populations. So we're sort of back to that. There's no genetic basis for race. And again, I'm really sort of hammering this message, but heritability doesn't mean that something is determined and unchangeable. So I mentioned specific populations at specific times, and I talked about national curriculums, curricula. But what I'll do is I'll switch my example, because if we think about a time in history or a place in the world where there's quite a strict religious expectation. You know, everybody in that time or that place was expected to go to church. They were expected to engage with kind of religious festivals and that kind of thing. if we ask those people, how religious do you feel, there would be variation. Some people would be very pious, some people would be much less sort of interested in religion. But because the environment is so stable for everyone, all these same expectations, then more of that variance that we find in people would be accounted for by genetic variance. Whereas if we think of a time or a place where there's a very liberal attitude to religion and you can do whatever you want, um, because of the increased variation in that environment, we would see less of the variation explained by genetics. Now, I realize I'm getting a little bit technical here, so I think I'll move on. Um, Heritability, this idea of genetic influences, it can change across the lifespan. And just briefly here, you can see that our heritability estimates for IQ or intelligence, and that's a whole other question about what is IQ, that we're not going to cover that one, but that actually increases across the lifespan. So as we age through infancy and childhood, more of the variation in a population in intelligence gets explained by genes rather than environments, which sort of seems a little bit counterintuitive. But the logic is, as you grow up, you get more control over your environment. You don't just have to go and do the classes that your teachers tell you to do. You get to choose. You get to pick your school subjects, your university degree. You get, or not, not disengage with education. So because you're getting more control over your environment, it narrows down to more closely match your genetic predispositions. Again, these are big concepts. So if you're taking
Food for
anything from
thought.
this, yeah, definitely food for thought. Um, and it's really worth knowing about, because I think miscomprehensions about these things, especially when it comes to determinism, can have negative impacts. Because if, for example, I were to tell you that dyslexia was 60% heritable, the outcome is not to go, oh well, let's just not even bother teaching people with dyslexia. They'll never get it. It's in their blood, it's in their genes, there's no point. And that's not true at all. That's just not true. So there's this idea of the mixed blessing model. If we approach it with the right attitude, this sort of information, we can actually make outcomes better for children and babies and adults and everyone in between. Okay, so that was a little bit heavy. I mentioned earlier that people are generally quite good at estimating how important genes are for certain traits. And I thought I'd just pick out one that's quite interesting and look at a cross-cultural difference. Now, yeah, we didn't target collections in France, unfortunately, but these are people who either attributed sexual orientation to being entirely genetic. Sorry, that's in the green on the right. So they say yes, it's completely and utterly in the genes. The environments don't matter. And then in the orange, we have people who entirely attribute it to environments and completely sort of disregard any kind of genetic influence. And I think there's some interesting cross-cultural differences there to muse on. So there are very interesting things we can find out about attitudes and opinions and what people kind of think and know about these things. So heritability, part of the problem with this word is that it can mean two things. My phone is technically heritable. I can leave this to somebody else. When I depart this mortal coil, I can say, here, have my phone. So my phone has the property of heritability. But what we're talking about is a population-based statistic that explains how much of the variation in that population is due to genes and how much to environments. But it's very complex, so more food for thought. There was a real interest in the sort of late 90s, early noughties about trying to find specific genes that were connected with specific traits. And that works quite well for diseases, although that's an area of research that is ongoing. But it doesn't really work very well for traits, because traits are complex. So you might see things, studies about the warrior gene or the FTO gene, which is the gene. Well, it was sort of not advertised, but it was talked about as if it's the gene that will make you fat or not. Now, something like body mass index or weight is not going to be the product of a single gene. It's going to be complex availability of food, appetite, metabolism, all sorts of things. So, just a word of warning: if you do ever see things that say, "Oh, yeah, this is definitely the gene that has been linked to something else," just it probably isn't. It probably wouldn't replicate, probably wouldn't be found in another population. But what we can do is look for lots and lots and lots of these things that might be associated with how we differ as people. And we can add them all up and weight them and then take that number and say, okay, could that tell us anything about how people differ in a population? And that's what we call genome wide polygenic scoring. And this is sort of the cutting edge of things because, in theory, what could happen when they take that heel prick test just after birth? It's not going to be long now before it just gets cheaper to sequence the baby's entire genome rather than just looking for those 9 simple things, those 9 monogenic disorders. Data-wise, it's just going to be cheaper to sequence the whole genome, and that will throw up more data. It will throw up things that we don't have treatments for yet. Do you, as a parent, want to know that? Do you as a parent, have a right to know that? What about the privacy of your newborn baby? Maybe they don't want you to know their polygenic risk for developing schizophrenia or having difficulties with educational achievement. And quite often, what we find is what people think about these risks is actually much more impactful than the risks themselves. So polygenic scoring is here. It's been around maybe close to 10 years, I would say, and it's getting more and more refined. So we're being able to tell more and more about anyone, newborn babies particularly, and how they may experience their lives. So that's one of the things that's sort of at the cutting edge of where we are now with genetics. Another thing is that in 2020, the Nobel Prize was won for a gene editing technology, which technically means that it's now possible in a large number of circumstances to edit the genome. So if a child is found to have, well, let's stick with PKU. In theory, this technology could be used to snip out the 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 gene variant that is causing PKU and splice in the wild type, we would call it, so the sort of the non-PKU variant. So that is technically possible now. It's a technology that's being constantly refined, but this will have impacts for kind of reproductive choices and parental choices. It's even without gene editing technology. If anybody has undergone fertility treatment, it's pretty standard offering now to do pre-implantation genetic screening. So that could be used to identify more viable embryos. But again, with this whole genome sequencing, we could maybe, and parents could maybe make other choices, which sort of leads me into this slide. There are clinics in the United States that are offering fertility treatment for things as abstract as eye color. So in theory, parents could sign up to these fertility clinics and say, we want a baby with blue eyes or green eyes or brown eyes. This clinic will sequence the fertilized embryos and will say, okay, yeah, these 3 will have brown eyes, these 2 will have yellow eyes, green eyes. Which would you like to proceed with? Now, a big issue with that is that even eye color is not monogenic. There are at least 16 genetic variants associated with eye color. And if you've got 16 genes in the mix, you end up with about 45 million different eye colors. So how they're offering this, it's the science isn't there. And even if it was, it's this okay? It doesn't feel okay to me. On a more positive note, gene therapy can be kind of fantastic. And we recently had a case in the news here of Teddy, who received a multi-million pound gene therapy as treatment for metachromatic leukodystrophy. So there is some amazing stuff happening. Even not on the sort of the biological level, but just conceptually, this analogy here is starting to be used in counseling settings, and it's really a way of helping people think about the relative. uh, So, if somebody has a very genetic, like sort of deterministic view, I have depression because both my parents had it, my brother has it, my aunt and uncle has it. It's just something I have to live with, and it's something I can't do anything about. What this model can do is it can say to them, well, that might all be true, but there's still space. It's not going to be determined. You can still have this sort of control over the environment. You might have to be more careful with your environment than other people, but the environment still matters. And it also, the other extreme, it's being found useful when people are very environmentally essentialist. Oh, if only I could change my job, if only I could get out of this relationship, then everything would be fine. And again, this model helps people kind of come to this middle ground of, okay, it's not just all that or all this. It is going to be both of these things that are important. So these conceptual ideas are quite important. And you can kind of use this analogy for educational achievement or parenting choices. I mentioned earlier the gene editing technology. You may have seen the news in 2018. Dr. Yi was the first scientist illegally, I believe he's still under house arrest, to edit the germline. Now, if I had CRISPR treatment in my personally, it would make edits within my body. But the germline are sperms and eggs, and what Dr. Yi did is he engineered uh, the genes in the germline, which means that the children that were born as a result of his experimentation could pass that mutation down to their children. So it now has kind of transgenerational population level implications. So this is a huge area of controversy at the moment. I think I was probably meant to wrap up by now. On this sort of population level, um, genetically modified organisms, they had a terrible time in the press, certainly in the UK here, when they started emerging in the 90s. And there's been a huge resistance to it. But actually, a lot of the whole kind of process of generating GM crops is incredibly highly regulated and safe. Traditional methods of farming often use radiation, so they'll bombard crops with radiation in order to force mutations, in order to increase yield or kind of develop pest resistance. And there's far less regulation about that as a agricultural method. So again, a little bit of genetic literacy, a little bit of understanding about these things can have very personal impacts, but also more global. So I have taken a very broad overview of everything. I hope there was something of interest there. And yeah, happy to have some questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. You've given us so much to think about and to reflect upon. And I think as parents, this is so important that we actually take the time and we put in the effort to understand it, because it's easy to have this kind of blanket kind of attitude towards everything genetic, like yes to everything or no to everything. I want to control
Yeah,
everything, or there is nothing I can control. And actually, yeah, it's important to really take the time and consider this. I believe, especially with this idea that when our children have some genetic predisposition, I think it's an invitation for us to actually think even harder about the environment, because that's when
yeah,
however small or little our power is, that's the power we have, and
yeah.
that's where we can come in and support them.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the real power of all this information is. It's not about
Yeah,
making choices at the genetic level. It's about, okay, well, what can we do at an environmental level? So if we think about education, it's not about streaming children into schools based on some very poorly understood risk score from sequencing their genomes. It's about saying, okay, what, like for example, if we were able to identify children who maybe will have difficulties with reading, we can then maybe introduce an intervention earlier than when they start to try to learn to read. So introduce kind of phonological activities while they're still in the kind of, because babies have a fantastic neuroplasticity. They've got this huge great babies have more neurons than we do. So if we can sort of identify them while they're still in that very rich phase, and offer an intervention that will prevent the development of the difficulty, that would be amazing. But even
Yeah.
without the sort of specific to the individual, just sort of, realizing you don't know why this child is struggling. You can't attribute it to one factor. It's going to be loads of different things, and just having some empathy and some patience and some time. Yeah, so just these sort of abstract things, very specific things, but I really don't think, maybe in 2 or 3 generations people might be making reproductive choices about the DNA of their offspring, but it's never going to. I'm confident that I will not be here when those problems are are facing us.
Yes, and even if like there are things that affect us every single day, like we can, like, knowing about genetics and environment is going to be very helpful, not just to potentially make one day that one choice or refuse that one choice. It's really
Yeah,
about how we live our lives with the people around us, how we try to understand each other, how we relate to each other.
I think so.
It's interesting what you just said made me think of a friend that had a change in career and started studying neuroscience. And I asked him, so what, like around 40 years old or so, I asked him, so what was the thing that you learned and that really changed? Like, why are you liking studying neuroscience? And he was like, you know what? It's actually, I stopped asking or yes or no question or black and white question. I begin to understand that it's all more complex and interesting
Yeah,
and fascinating and wonderful than I thought it was. And I think this is the
yeah,
attitude that we really
absolutely,
want to promote here at Baby Brains and
absolutely,
Goldsmith as well, right? Yeah. So thank
absolutely.
you,
Yeah,
because this
yeah.
really gives us, yeah, lots
A
of
lot of
of
food for
material to
thought.
think about.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, and especially when you have a topic that on the surface seems very binary: nature, nurture, genes, environments. It's a complete false dichotomy. Well,
Yeah.
nature versus nurture is a false dichotomy. I mean, well, actually, I was going to say a gene is a known thing, but actually, geneticists don't even agree on what a gene is. So yeah, live in the grey area. That's where,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So we can feel this passion for you, and so we were just like that. You are so passionate about this topic, and wanted to ask you a little bit about your personal journey that brought you here to study behavioral genetics at
Yeah,
Goldsmith. Like, how
yeah.
did it come about for you?
It's an interest. Well, I don't know if it's interesting, and I don't know quite how much to share. But I grew up in the church. I grew up in the Church of England, and so a lot of the way the world was explained to me was through that ideology, and it just didn't make that much sense to me. It felt like it wasn't providing satisfactory answers. And so that sort of move away from that was the thing that sort of pushed me into being interested in biology, genetics, psychology, but in a very roundabout way, because my first degree was in English, and then I worked in disability support for years. And so I came to my PhD in my, well, late 30s. So yeah, I had a complete sort of shift and epiphany. And then I had the very good fortune of meeting a fantastic um, academic, one of the most intelligent and kind people I've ever met. Who was my PhD supervisor. Her name's Professor Yulia Kovas, and she's also at Goldsmiths. And we will try and convince her to do one of these if we repeat the
Please
session
keep on
next year.
trying.
She's on research leave at the moment, but I
She's
will persuade her.
amazing.
I will use all my charm. And that was
Yeah,
quite a life changing
please.
moment. Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely.
Yeah. What an exciting life. We want to call you back to hear more about this. It's really exciting, like personal journeys, and it's interesting. Yeah, yeah, for another time. um, the nature nurture debate is very popular among lay people as well, because it's not everybody knows that it's been put to bed, as you beautifully said before,
Yeah.
and it's still kind of an easy way to put people against each other, or to kind of, you know, animate a debate about something. And so there is this kind of misconception that if something is nature, then there is nothing we can change about it. If it's nurture, we can do determine everything.
Yeah.
And so I guess everything you're doing, all your research, is kind of busting this myth. Um, how can we tell people in an easy, quick way, like kind of
Yeah.
busting really this
So
myth? What do you think?
so I'm curious because I haven't had the nature versus nurture debate for years, but I do remember dinner parties and things where it would come up. And the mere fact that not everybody agreed shows you that it's not a functional debate, because some people say, oh, I blame the parents, some people will say, oh, I blame the genetics, I blame the teacher. Let's just stop blaming anyone. I think that's um how do we, well, I guess it's not the most enthralling example, but I really think that PKU example does that quite nicely, because it is a disorder with a known genetic etiology that can be completely managed at an environmental level. So it even if we know in this nature versus nurture paradigm that it's a nature thing, that doesn't mean that the nurture is dropped down to the equation. In fact, it makes nurture even more important. Um, and I think if people just reflect on their own experiences, do you feel as a person that you are just the product of one or the other? Would you say you would be no different now if you had different parents or different life experiences? And I also think, actually, particularly with parents, now I don't have children of my own, but I have done a lot of child minding and work with children in my life. When you see two siblings, the differences in them are just remarkable. The personality differences, the dispositional differences. And so you can see, especially if they have the same biological parents. Now, there will be genetic differences between them, but you can see that we're complex. We're complex.
Yeah.
Definitely. So yeah, I don't have
Yeah.
a quick. Well, I think the PKU is the quick answer, but I don't think that's a sort of a headline
PKU.
grabbing answer. Yeah, PKU. Tell people about
No, but now
PKU.
we all know. Yeah, absolutely. And now we have an easy way to do that. You explained it so beautifully. So we have our YouTube video to go back to if we want to find the information again. That's fantastic. I think the last thing I would like to ask you before our time runs out is, we were discussing epigenetics and similar topics with Dr. Livio Provenzi a few weeks ago, and he was
Uh,
talking about the importance of parenting. And now what you were saying is also like, if you're a parent, you give your child 100%. Well, you give the genes that they have, they come from you, right?
mhm.
The
Yeah,
environment they have comes in large amount from you as well, not 100%, of
yeah,
course, but you are, so you have a big role to play there. You are playing this role, like just naturally, without doing anything specific. um, so what is it like? Because what we see in parents, we can have this, not even trying, because anyways it's genetics, or we can have this anxiety that comes from thinking, oh, I have
right.
to be the perfect parent, I have to provide everything that I can provide. This idea, especially in big cities, I think of exposing babies to every possible thing in the first 6 months of life, so where's the balance there? Like, how can we help parents support their children in a healthy way?
Oh,
Very
you
difficult,
saved the easy question for
yeah.
last. um,
Sorry.
oh, blimey. Uh, well, enjoy it. Enjoy parenting, and I think realize that there is no such thing as the perfect approach. I mean, there are so so. I've talked a little bit about what we might call genetic myths, but there are a lot of myths, and I think neuromyths. So kind of um, Mozart, baby Mozart. You know, if you play Mozart to your unborn child, it will be a genius and things like this. It's just having the critical faculty to go, is that right? Because as far as I know, there's very few things like reading with your child. It seems to be quite predictive of nice outcomes down the line. But a lot of it is just people trying to sell you CDs or something. So yeah, be mindful, enjoy the experience. It's not really genetics, but sort of there are critical phases, you know. So babies do find it easier to learn languages and to distinguish phonemes in the first couple of months of their life. Um, you know, but that doesn't mean you have to raise them bilingually or do you know what I mean? It's just like don't worry, enjoy it. It's very easy to say for a non-parent,
Yeah.
but yeah, just be
No, I think we
mindful of
need
the
to
myth.
hear it. I think, yes, I think it's so important to just go with it, go with the flow, enjoy, have
Yeah,
fun in it. Because you were saying something really interesting before as well. It's like it's what you think about the genetic predisposition that actually
yeah,
makes a difference. Like,
yes.
oh,
So that's yeah,
whatever you do, if you're anxious about it, that's gonna be bad.
yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
on the opposite, if you whatever you do, do it happily.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
other thing you said that I really think is important is like apply your brain power. Like think about it. If it doesn't feel right,
yeah,
if you think there is, look into that. And it's not
yeah,
always that
exactly.
your gut feeling is correct, but if your gut feeling makes you raise an eyebrow, just look into that,
Yeah,
and it's worth
yeah.
spending the time. It's also fun, right?
I think so. I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
will. That's. I was referencing a particular study there, and what they did is they misinformed people about a genetic variant they had that was they said was related to exercise tolerance, and they put people on treadmills, and what they found was if people thought they had the bad variant, their performance reduced quite markedly, not just psychologically but physiologically, like their heart rates, their VO2 max. These things were affected by what they thought, not what was actually in their genome. So yeah, that what we think really is important. It really is. Yeah, yeah. So there we go.
Anyway, it's too complex to figure it all out. So
Yeah, and
let's
that's the
just
other thing. Yeah,
go with
exactly.
it.
Don't get lost in them. But people make their whole lives out of your friend, your neuroscientist friend. Will be studying this very narrow thing. Leave that to other people, unless you want to spend 3 of your years of your life doing a PhD. But just yeah, be critical, be mindful, be joyful. Um, uh, yeah, and yeah, that's it. That's
This
all I've
is a
got.
wonderful, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to ask you for a catchphrase, but you gave it to us already, so that's fantastic. uh,
Don't worry,
it
be
was
happy.
really wonderful. Yeah, it was really wonderful to talk to you, Robert Chapman. It
Yeah,
was
I've really
really
enjoyed it.
amazing, and we hope to have you back very soon. We
I
need this
will
kind
look
of
forward to it.
conversation for parents.
I think,
It really helps, it
yeah,
edifies us, and it really helps us live our life better and provide our children with a better environment to grow up in. So thank you
that's
so
it. The
much to
environment
Robert,
matters.
to Goldsmith.
It was lovely
Yes,
talking to you.
thank you so much. uh, thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of
I
the
don't.
day.
Oh, there it is. I've lost my
Thanks.
mouse. Have a lovely
Thanks.
time. Great talking to you. Cheers, Sylvia. Bye now.
Yes. Bye bye. Bye.
But oh,